Thank you for having me back. Some of you may recall that I was here 2 years ago when my first book, Full Asylum, came out, and I talked to you then. And after that, I actually went on a considerable amount of book touring around the country. I went to a number of states that I hadn't been to before. And as a result of that, I've now been to 45 states. So by Obama math, I only have 12 more to go. Speaking of Mr. Obama, I'm sure you all heard about his speech 2 weeks ago when he said that ISIS, the Islamic State, is not Islamic. Now, I don't know how you reacted. My reaction was, how stupid is this guy? He must think that Starbucks is some sort of outer space currency. But all right, so I was trained as a scientist, and my professors always told me, even when you think you know the answer, do the research, do the experiment. You might be surprised. That's how many of the great discoveries in science were made. So in that spirit, I want to share with you some research that I've been doing about the Islamic world to look more deeply into the question, is the Islamic State Islamic? And I think the approach to take to this question is to look in the history of Islam and what are the great currents, what are the great intellectual trends, what were the key pivotal moments and so on. And once you understand those, see how ISIS fits into that. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to take you through all 1,400 years of Islamic history tonight. I'm not even going to go back to the beginning with Muhammad and the Quran. As I'm sure you know, there are a lot of verses in the Quran that sound very much like ISIS, verses about the Jews being cursed, or verses about making war on the infidel. But you're probably already familiar with those. What I'd like to focus on is what I think was a key period in Islamic history, which was the 100 years from the year roughly 1090 to 1190. If you look at that century, at the beginning of that period of 100 years, the Islamic world was very scientifically oriented and very tolerant to Jews and Christians, and somewhat lax about enforcing Sharia. And I know some of you don't believe me when I say those things. I've met people at tea parties who have said, oh, no Muslim anytime ever made any contribution to science. And well, that's just not true, and I'll be addressing that in a few minutes. But during that period of 100 years, there was a religious revival. And by the end of that century, toleration had been replaced, of Jews and Christians had been replaced by persecution, and science had been replaced by mysticism, and there was a crackdown on the enforcement of Sharia law. So, what did the Islamic world look like in the year 1090? I'm going to talk about the Eastern Islamic world, roughly Iran and Iraq. But then I'll speak briefly at the end about the Western Islamic world, Egypt and Spain. But basically, this was the trend that I'm talking about was across the Muslim world. The same things that happened in Iran and Iraq happened in Egypt and Spain. So in the Eastern Islamic world at that time was governed by something called the Great Seljuk Empire, which was run by a sultan. His name was Malik Shah al-Jalali. Al-Jalali is Persian, literally means like the glorious. Malik Shah the Glorious was what he was called. And he did have a very glorious reign. He was also called the King of the East and the West because his territory extended all the way from the borders of India to the Mediterranean. And he was not, however, the only power to be in the land, because in addition to the Sultan Malik Shah, who had his capital in Isfahan in Persia, there was a caliph named al-Muqtadi who ruled in Baghdad. And caliph literally in Arabic means like a successor or a representative. The idea was that the caliph was Muhammad's successor on earth, just as in the Catholic faith, the Pope is Christ's deputy on earth. And the analogy of the Pope is really very appropriate because the division of labor between the Sultan and the Caliph was that the Sultan had the secular power and the Pope, excuse me, the Caliph was like the Pope, was in charge of religious affairs. Now, of course, I'm sure you know that in Islam, religion is everything. Technically, there is no such thing as secular matters. Everything is governed by Sharia. So in theory, the caliph was the senior official and the sultan was merely his instrument. But in practice, being in charge of secular affairs meant being in charge of the military, so the sultan had the real power. And often he was telling the caliph what to do instead of the other way around. So that's what the government looked like in 1090. As far as the lot of Jews and Christians in the Seljuk Empire, okay, they were second-class citizens. I'm sure you've all heard the term dhimmi, meaning a protected person. The idea was they were non-Muslims under Muslim protection, but just like with the mafia, they paid for that protection. They paid the tax that was called the jizya that, Jews and Christians had to pay, and Muslims did not. But if you recognize the authority of the Sultan's government, and if you paid the jizya, they otherwise left you alone. At that time, they really didn't care that much if you weren't Muslim. As a matter of fact, they preferred that you weren't because they wanted to collect that extra tax from you. And in fact, there were even cases where communities of Christians and Jews wanted to convert, and the Muslim authorities tried to discourage them for that reason. Many Jews and Christians were very successful. They became very wealthy, leading citizens. They even got to very high positions within the Sultan's government. In particular, there was a Jew, his name was Ibn Samha, and he was in charge of all the Sultan's real estate operations in Baghdad. I mentioned the Sultan had his capital in Isfahan, but he had a palace and in Baghdad, and all his senior officials had houses there so that they could use when they went there on official business. And this Jewish guy, Ibn Samha, was in charge of managing all those properties. Now, it was interesting because at that time, the Sultan was also building a grand mosque in Baghdad, so I can't help wondering whether this Jew was also in charge of building the mosque. I would tend to go with his portfolio, but the history books don't really tell us one way or the other. There were also in Baghdad many churches, and in particular, there were two large monasteries. One were Nestorian and one was Jacobite. They were very close to the caliph's palace, so they let the Christians build in a good neighborhood. And the Muslims actually liked to visit these monasteries. They were beautiful buildings. They had pictures on the walls that you couldn't have in the mosque. There were lovely gardens. And there's something else at churches that you can't get in a mosque. Does anybody want to tell me what was that?
Good wine.
Good wine, exactly. Good wine. So the Muslims did like to visit the churches. They were very popular tourist destinations for that reason. In terms of the sciences, I could give a whole talk, just on that, but in a 30-minute speech, I can only have time for one example. And the example I'm going to give you is a name that you may be familiar with, but not as a scientist, rather as a poet. The name is Omar Khayyam. We in the West know him as the author of the collection of verses called the Rubaiyat. In the Muslim world, he's mainly known as an astronomer and a mathematician, and he was all these things. The Sultan Malik Shah built a very large, very sophisticated for the time observatory in Isfahan, and it had a staff of 8 people who we know the names of, and we don't know how many working for them whose names we don't know. And Omar Khayyam was the head of this whole big science project. And this observatory did very good work. They came up with a new calendar called the Jalali calendar. I mentioned a minute ago Malik Shah was Malik Shah al-Jalali. They named the calendar after him. And the Jalali calendar is still in use in Iran today, and it is more accurate than the Gregorian calendar that we use. Our calendar is off by 1 day every 3,000 years. The Jalali calendar is only off by 1 day every 5,000 years. To do that, you have to have a very good measurement of the length of the year, and that requires some sophisticated instrument buildings, and the Muslim astronomers were very good at that. They took a lot of the instruments like the armillary sphere and the mural quadrant, things that the ancient Greeks knew about, but they made them much more accurate, much more precise. Omar Khayyam was also a very sophisticated mathematician. He came up with some new methods, geometric methods for solving cubic equations. And he was also a philosopher. He wrote a number of papers about metaphysics and ethics and epistemology. And at that time, this was very common for philosophers and scientists to be the same people. The split between the two professions hadn't really happened yet. And as a matter of fact, in the books of the Middle Ages, both in the Muslim world and in the Christian world, the terms philosopher and scientist are pretty much used interchangeably. Of course, as I said, in the West, we know Omar for his poetry, and there was one subject that he seems to talk about in his poetry more than any other, and that is wine. There were 110 verses in the first one of the early English collections of the Rubaiyat, and of those 110, 22 were about wine. So 1 in 5. The guy liked his wine. But Omar, so here you have this guy who is a scientist. He likes to drink. And by the way, also in his poetry, he questions some of the key concepts of the Muslim religion. He never questions God, that never even comes up, but he does question, heaven and hell, which if you read the Quran is just much more central in Islam than it is in Christianity or even Judaism. And yet, this person who does many things which we consider un-Islamic, nevertheless was the head of this big project and a very close friend with the Sultan Malik Shah. He wasn't made into a pariah for these beliefs or for wine drinking and so on. So far what I've described does not sound very much like ISIS. So what changed? Well, what changed? There were always people in the Muslim world, both among the intellectuals and what we would today call the Muslim street, that were somewhat suspicious of these scientists and who didn't like that they weren't enforcing Sharia, and they didn't like that they were being so tolerant towards Jews and Christians. And these people found a very effective voice in a scholar by the name of Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was the head of the University of Baghdad at age 33. So that's, very impressive. He was a very brilliant man. There's a story that when he was, I think, a teenager and he had learned everything his master had to teach him, so he was traveling to another city to, study under a different master who would teach him other things. And on the road, he got robbed. And among other things, the bandits took his notebooks. And he begged them, "Give them back. I'm a scholar. I have to have my notebooks." And the leader of this gang of thieves laughed at him. He said, "Well, you couldn't be a very good scholar if you can't get along without your notebooks." And Al-Ghazali decided, he's right. And after that, he always dedicated himself to memorizing everything. It's said that he knew 300,000 stories about Muhammad. I think he made some of them up, but it's impressive nevertheless. Anyway, Al-Ghazali was also a very unpleasant man. I'll give you a couple examples of that. He was taking science lessons from our friend Omar Khayyam. But since science he viewed as profane, he didn't want anybody to know this. He took the lessons in secret. He went to Omar's house early in the morning. And then while he was there, he was a jerk about it. Like one day they were having this discussion about some fine point of geometry that affects the astronomy, their models of astronomy. And after arguing for some time, they got interrupted by the cry of the muezzin calling the people to prayer, as I'm sure you've heard at the first scene of any movie that ever took place in the Islamic world, right? They got the panoramic view of the city followed by, with the cry of the muezzin. And Omar and Al-Ghazali were interrupted by this call, and Al-Ghazali says, "Finally, truth calls us away from error." So it wasn't very nice of him. But Omar got the last laugh because he finally got sick of this. And what he did was he hired a band. And he had the band hide up on the roof of his house. And when Al-Ghazali finished his lesson that day and started to leave, Omar signaled the band to start playing. So all the people in the neighborhood came gathering around to see what was going on and find out why there was a band playing so early in the morning. And they saw Al-Ghazali leaving Omar's house, so the secret was out. Al-Ghazali made, I don't know if good is the right word, but he made use of his science lessons. He wrote a book. This is it. Oh, it's not the original. It's called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And remember what I said before, philosopher and scientist were interchangeable at that time. So it's like how the scientists were so incoherent. And what Al-Ghazali said in this book was that all this science, it's not that it's heresy per se, it's just not very useful. It can't prove the great truths of the Muslim religion. It can't prove that God exists and that he's one and that he created the universe and that that he would resurrect the dead someday and so on. So, and this book, critical of science, was hugely influential. I mean, people didn't stop doing science completely in the Muslim world after that, but they did a lot less of it. And the people who were doing it tended to be a lot more isolated, a lot farther from the great centers of Islamic culture. They tend to be in places like Samarkand or in what's now Uzbekistan, for example. What's that? Cleveland? That reminds me of, I mentioned my great physics professors a little earlier. There was actually a famous physics experiment that was done in Cleveland. It was called the Michelson-Morley experiment, and my professor said that had to be the most important thing that ever happened there. But, so the incoherence of the philosophers was very influential, not only on science, but also politically, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So that was Al-Ghazali. This is the Times of India. September 17th, 2014. ISIS bans math, sports, and social studies for children. The Sunni militant group has captured a slew of Syrian and Iraqi cities in recent months. They issued a letter. It says that the teachers, educators must only teach things belonging to Islam and to denounce infidelity and infidels. They cannot teach the laws of physics and chemistry unless they say that those laws are due to Allah's rules. That was actually a key point in the incoherence of the philosophers. Al-Ghazali had a real problem with cause and effect with the laws of physics and chemistry, because if there were certain laws in which the universe worked, that meant God couldn't do anything. And this was a problem. So that's why, that's the same idea that we now see 900 years later, where ISIS says, if you're going to teach these laws, you have to explain, they're subject to God's rules. I'd like to read from another book by Al-Ghazali. This was a law book that he wrote, a book about Sharia. So it's not his own ideas, it's just his explaining what the Sharia says. He says, one must go on jihad at least once a year. One may use a catapult against the non-Muslims when they are in a fortress, even if among them are women and children. One may set fire to them and or drown them. If a person of the book, so a Jew or a Christian, is enslaved, his marriage is automatically annulled, which of course means then you can do whatever you want with his wife. One may cut down their trees. One must destroy their useless books. Jihadists may take as booty whatever they decide. They may steal as much food as they need. The dhimmi is obliged not to mention Allah or his apostle. Jews, Christians, and Magians must pay the jizya. On offering up the jizya, the dhimmi must hang his head while the official takes hold of his beard and hits him on the protuberant bone beneath the ear. So in other words, it's not enough that the dhimmi pays the jizya. You have to humiliate him while he's paying it. They are not permitted to ostentatiously display their wine or church bells. Their houses may not be higher than the Muslims, no matter how low that is. The dhimmi may not ride an elegant horse or mule. He may ride a donkey, only if the saddle is made of wood. He may not walk on the good part of the road. They have to wear an identifying patch on their clothing. Dhimmis must hold their tongue. That's Al-Ghazali. This is CNN. February 28th, 2014. Christian residents of Raqqa, and by the way, Raqqa you may have heard of because it was one of the cities that we bombed last night. Christian residents of Raqqa, once one of the nation's most liberal cities, will have to pay as much as 17 grams of gold per adult male in an annual payment, the extremist group ISIS said in a statement posted online this week. The group is also forbidding the city's Christians from repairing or refurbishing their churches and monasteries, said the statement, which has been circulated in the city. The list of constraints imposed by the militants also limits Christian worship, business activities, and alcohol consumption. One thing the extremist group have forbidden, other things the extremist group have forbidden Christians in Raqqa from doing include exposing crosses or their books to Muslims, making any recitations or ringing any church bells that can be heard by Muslims, trading pigs or alcohol to Muslims in their markets, and drinking alcohol in public. So this list I read you 900 years ago from Al-Ghazali's book about Sharia, then we find almost the identical list today, being enforced by ISIS. Clearly, when we talk about Al-Ghazali, we're seeing something that looks a lot more like ISIS that we didn't see when we talked about Umar Khayyam. I said Al-Ghazali had a great deal of political influence as well as philosophical influence. And to see that, fast forward 100 years to the year 1180. And in 1180, the caliphate was taken over by a gentleman named An-Nasr. And An-Nasr achieved something that his predecessors had tried and failed. He got rid of the sultans. Imagine, thinking of the Pope metaphor again, if the Pope had managed to overthrow the government of Italy and rule both the secular and the sacred worlds by himself. That was the magnitude of what happened to the Seljuk Empire. The Seljuks were overthrown, and An-Nasr ruled Iraq by himself. And once he did this, he proceeded to establish a theocratic dictatorship. They cracked down on Jews and Christians. The Jews and Christians that were in the government were purged from the government. Part of the reason for that, An-Nasr was a very greedy, avaricious man. He didn't like the idea of giving money to Jews and Christians. That was like the worst part of having them in the government. And they put where I said 100 years before, they didn't care that much if they were Muslim. Now they put a great deal of pressure on them to convert. And they didn't do it the way you usually hear, by the sword. They did it with economic pressure. They set up this system of guilds and, like trade unions. And you couldn't practice certain professions unless you were in the guild. And here was the catch: you couldn't join the guild unless you were a Muslim. So, because of this mechanism, many Jews and Christians started to convert to Islam. They also, started to enforce Sharia, with much more vigor. Closing wine shops, for example, things like that. And An-Nasr, in carrying out these measures, had a right-hand man, a mystic by the name of Suhrawardi. Suhrawardi wrote a number of books, and even though he never mentions Al-Ghazali, his books sound a lot like Al-Ghazali, even uses some of the same examples. And this is not an accident, because Suhrawardi studied under his uncle, who was also named Suhrawardi, and the uncle studied under Ahmad Ghazali, who was the brother and the disciple of Muhammad Ghazali, who I talked about earlier. So we have this direct line of students and teachers leading from Al-Ghazali to the people who were establishing this dictatorship, which they did ruthlessly. And to use a phrase that I heard on television once, they did it using all the hideous apparatus of the police state. It was like Soviet Russia. They had spies everywhere who would report you if you weren't living according to Sharia. And they also monopolized all the means of communication. A good way to communicate over distances in those days were by carrier pigeon. An-Nasr, passed laws that only the government could own carrier pigeons. So they created this dictatorship. There you go. There was only the government media. So I've told you a bit. What's it just like today? Yeah. So I told you a bit about what happened in the eastern part of the Islamic world. In the western part, it was exactly the same thing in that century. In Egypt, the reasonably tolerant and enlightened Fatimid dynasty got overthrown by another name that you probably know, Saladin. We tend to romanticize Saladin because of his relationship with Richard the Lionhearted, but he was a hardcore jihadist. He went to war against the Christians, and in his own land, he also cracked down on Jews and Muslims. He wasn't quite as strict as an-Nasr. If they really needed somebody's skills, they would let him stay. And in Spain, the reasonably tolerant Almoravid dynasty was then overthrown in that same century by the Almohad dynasty. One of the names that we know around here, Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher, we tend to know that name because there's a Maimonides school in Brookline. But Maimonides' family fled Spain, for Egypt, to flee from persecution under the Almohads. So we see in this key century from 1080 or 1090 to 1190, just this huge sea change in the Muslim world, where they went from, the world of Omar Khayyam, scientific, philosophical, tolerant, to the world of an-Nasr and al-Ghazali, cracking down on Jews and Christians, replacing the scientists with mystics, and enforcing Sharia much more strictly. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm a novelist by profession, and I am writing a novel about all of this, which is why I did the research in the first place. It will tell this story about how the Muslim world made this transition from tolerance to intolerance and so on. It's also a very good mystery story because Malik Shah died under very suspicious circumstances 6 weeks after his prime minister was assassinated, and in the same month as the Jewish official that I mentioned, Ibn Samha, died. The history books tell us he was killed. There's only one line in there. It doesn't say anything about how or who did it. So that all happened in real life. In my fiction book, I'm going to solve the mystery. I have a sign-up sheet in the back of the room if you'd like to get on my email list and get a notice when the book comes out. Please, I encourage you to sign up. I'd like to leave you with an excerpt from a letter. I mentioned Maimonides a couple minutes ago. This letter was written by a student of Maimonides, a guy named Joseph ben Judah. And Rabbi Joseph visited Baghdad in 1192, so during the reign of an-Nasr, and he witnessed a book burning. There was a citizen, his name was Abd as-Salam, and he was accused of being an atheist, and the authorities took his books away, his library away, because obviously he was an atheist. These books must be full of heretical things. And they burned them in the public square. And Rabbi Joseph wrote in his letter, I saw in the hands of the Imam a work of astronomy. He showed the circle of which the author represented the celestial globe. See, he cried, the immense evil, the inexpressible disaster, the dark calamity. In saying these words, he tore the book and threw it on the fire. Thank you very much.